usually when we discuss environment issues and we discuss doing things for the nature, for the planet, for the well-being of our planet, and national reserves and so on, to our forests, I don't know, whatever. We usually tend to think that the whole world of business, of entrepreneurial stuff, of business factories, companies, it's usually perceived as something, as a threat, and only that. And that we usually, the environmentalists and all people that are dealing with ecology and so on, ecological stuff, they usually tend to think that they should first and foremost control firms, control companies, in order to not let them pollute our air and our seas and so on to such an extent that it would cause trouble for the nature and so on. And it's definitely right, it's 100% right. I'm not saying that it's not a right angle and it's not a right perspective, but there is also another perspective which should be also recognized, I think. This other perspective is the perspective that also of resources and of human needs, and the problem how to manage to make them good for each other and so on. And that the problem is that we usually think only about controlling firms, but we also forget about some other problem. This other problem is that if people are not provided with good business opportunities, if they are not provided with good jobs, and if the economy is not developing well, if there is not if the GDP per capita is going low and lower, and then the problem begins, that the other sort of problems begin. Like the problem is, for instance, we can perceive the result of such a situation in India, for instance, and in most of the developing countries. Usually when you are provided with a good job and with some business opportunities, whatever, and you are not so depending on human aid and so on, but you also are coping more or less okay in your work, and you can also get something from the shop for the money you earned and so on. So basically, when you are conducting a normal life of an employee, then you are usually not so much tempted to, for instance, rob the natural resources. For instance, if you are so depending on natural resources and you have no job, no opportunities, no perspectives, that you would, for instance, what's the way of keeping on going on living in such a situation? You would go to the forest and hunt, for instance, and kill those precious animals, and those animals which are sometimes near extinction, and so on. So you would rob the natural resources in order to live, and that's the whole point. If the environmentalists are so tempted to communist ideas, for instance, they totally forget that the sustainable economy is also very important, and because it makes us not so depending on natural resources. This is the paradox that they usually forget about. For instance, when in India we can observe that there are many people who are not really provided with any job at all, and they of course they are stealing natural resources, they are stealing from the forests, they are stealing, they are polluting the water, maybe more. I'm sure that it's more than one good prosperous company sometimes, that 1,000 people without a job can be a bigger damage to the natural resources, to the nature in general, than the one good prospering firm or factory, especially if this factory is provided with some elements that would make this polluting the air not so, some filters or something that would make this polluting air or water not so more difficult. And so if you, for instance, if the environmentalists are so tempted to share communist views, anti-business views of society, of our world, then usually they totally, I think they are totally, have a totally wrong perspective of the problem. For instance, and they are very much tempted to radical leftist views, because many environmentalists are really the ex-communists, the ex-socialists. They had to do something because they had to rebranch. They had to take some other tasks because they were not needed anymore as a socialists, especially when the left-wing politicians, the most famous ones, like Tony Blair, like Gerhard Schröder, like Wim Kok, like Göran Persson, in Sweden, the last was the prime minister of Sweden for many years. They have adopted this this so-called third way, so some middle ground between socialism and capitalism, or free market economy. Yeah, and when they adopted this this path, and when they took this path, the real socialists, they had nothing to do, so they just renamed. Many of them renamed as environmentalists, but of course not all of the environmentalists are leftists or something, but there is a huge proportion of them which who are radical leftists, and of course they share this communist or socialist approach to business, as if the business would do only harm, no good to society or to nature. And I would claim that it's just the opposite, that business can also save nature. If people are provided with good jobs, business opportunities, when the GDP per capita is going higher and higher, then usually people would not rob national resources to survive. And that's the whole point of this video. I wanted just to remind about it.